The ship was dying, and Elias Varn knew it. He sat in the cockpit of the Gentle Mercy and stared at the blinking red warning on the console screen that told him what he already felt in his stomach. The food synthesizer was gone, and it was not coming back. "Juno," he said quietly. "Yes, Captain," the ship AI responded in her calm, steady voice that had not changed in 14 years. "How long can I survive without food?" "At your current metabolic rate and assuming continued water access, I estimate 6 days before critical organ failure begins." Elias leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands and let out a long breath through his teeth. The nearest human outpost was 11 days away at maximum FTL, and there was no way around that math. 6 was less than 11, and dead was dead. He pulled up the star charts and studied the routes, and there was only one option that made any sense at all: Station Golhari, a massive trading hub that floated in the darkness of Vreth-controlled space, about 9 hours away at current speed. He did not want to go there. Nobody wanted to go to Vreth space unless they had to, because the Vreth Dominion was not the kind of empire that made visitors feel welcome. They were an insectoid species that had built their entire civilization on a single idea that the strong consume the weak, and they meant that literally. Elias had fought in the Terran-Kesari War 15 years ago, and he had seen terrible things during those long, bloody years. But he had heard stories about Vreth stations that made even old soldiers go quiet. But hunger was hunger, and death was death, and he did not have the luxury of being afraid. "Set course for Golhari," he told Juno. "Course set, Captain. I feel obligated to note that Vreth stations have a poor reputation regarding human visitors." "I know. And that you are unarmed." "I know that too. And that your last meal was 19 hours ago." "Juno." "Yes, Captain." "Stop helping." 9 hours later, the Gentle Mercy drifted into the docking ring of Station Golhari, and Elias got his first real look at the place through the cockpit window. It was enormous, a spinning wheel of dark metal and amber lights that stretched for kilometers in every direction, and even from outside, he could see the traffic flowing through its corridors, ships of every shape and size coming and going like insects around a hive. He docked at a lower ring port where the fees were cheap, and the questions were few, and he sealed up the ship and told Juno to keep the engines warm just in case. "Just in case of what, Captain?" "Just in case," he repeated, and he stepped through the airlock and into the station. The smell hit him first, a thick, heavy scent like burned sugar mixed with something organic and rotten that he could not identify and did not want to. The corridors were wide and tall, built for creatures much larger than humans, and the walls were covered in bioluminescent panels that pulsed with a slow amber rhythm like a heartbeat. There were aliens everywhere, dozens of species moving through the trading corridors in a river of scales and fur and chitin. And Elias noticed immediately that most of them walked with their heads down, and their bodies tight and small as if they were trying not to be noticed. The Vreth were easy to spot. They stood a full head taller than most other species, with dark segmented bodies and 4 arms and compound eyes that reflected the amber light like clusters of wet stones. They moved through the crowd slowly, and everything around them made way. Elias kept his head up and walked at a normal pace, and he felt the eyes on him, curious and confused, because humans were rare in this part of the galaxy, and most of these beings had never seen one in person. He found the main trading floor on the station's middle ring, a vast open space filled with stalls and counters and hovering display screens showing prices for goods in a dozen languages. And the noise was overwhelming, a roar of clicking and hissing and shouting that bounced off the metal walls. He was looking for a food vendor or a supply broker, anyone who could sell him enough rations for 10 days, and he had fuel rods in his pack that were worth good money anywhere in the galaxy. But as he moved deeper into the trading floor, he began to see things that made his steps slow down. cages. They were arranged along the far wall of the market in neat rows, and they were made of dark metal, with energy barriers humming across the front of each one, and inside the cages were living beings. Some were small and furred and curled in on themselves, and some were tall and thin with long limbs folded into spaces too small for them, and some were children. Elias stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the trading floor with aliens flowing around him like water around a rock, and he stared at those cages, and something in his chest went very still and very cold. A voice came from his right, clicking and buzzing, run through a translator that turned it into flat mechanical English. "Human, you are far from your territory." He turned and found himself looking up at a Vreth trade broker, taller than most, with decorative bands of gold wrapped around his upper arms and compound eyes that studied Elias with what the translator interpreted as amusement. "My name is Zilkar," the Vreth said, "and I am the senior broker of this market level. What brings a human to Golhari?" "I need food," Elias said simply, "enough for 10 days. I can pay in grade A fuel rods or mechanical labor." Zilkar tilted his massive head, and his mandibles clicked together in a rhythm that the translator tagged as laughter. "Food," he repeated, "such a simple need for such a long journey, you must be desperate." "I am," Elias admitted, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. Zilkar studied him for a long moment, and those compound eyes moved across Elias in a way that felt like being measured and weighed and priced. "We can provide what you need," Zilkar said, "but perhaps we can offer you something far more nourishing than simple rations." He raised one of his 4 arms and made a gesture, and 2 Vreth guards moved to the row of cages along the wall, and they dragged one forward, the metal scraping across the floor with a sound that cut through the noise of the market. The cage was small. Inside was a child. She was Solani. Elias knew the species from old briefing files, a scaled people with golden eyes and delicate features, who had once held a small, peaceful territory on the edge of Vreth space before the Dominion swallowed them whole. She could not have been more than the equivalent of 6 human years old, and she was thin and trembling, and her golden eyes were huge in her small face, but there was something in those eyes that was not just fear. There was a spark of defiance, a refusal to look away that hit Elias somewhere deep in his ribs. Zilkar gestured at the cage with a casual sweep of his arm, as if he were showing off a piece of furniture. "Solani young," he said, "very tender, considered a delicacy among our people, and at a special price for a new customer." The trading floor had gone quiet. Elias realized that dozens of aliens had stopped what they were doing and were watching, not with horror, but with a dull, resigned familiarity, as if this was something they had seen 100 times before. This was a test. He understood that now, the Vreth did this to every newcomer, offered the worst thing they could imagine and watched to see if they would break or bend or simply look away like everyone else. The child in the cage stared at him and he stared back, and the cold thing in his chest that had gone still when he first saw the cages began to move again, not with heat or rage, but with something much older and much more dangerous. A quiet and absolute certainty. Elias looked at the child and the child looked at him, and the entire trading floor held its breath. He could feel them watching, the Vreth brokers with their compound eyes glittering in the amber light, the other alien species frozen in place at their stalls and counters, even the guards standing behind the cage with their shock lances held loosely at their sides, everyone waiting to see what the human would do. He had seen this kind of moment before. 15 years ago, on a burning colony world during the HFY War, he had walked into a bombed-out shelter and found 17 children huddled in the dark, and he had carried them out one by one through smoke and fire and falling debris, while his squad held a perimeter against a Kesari assault wave. He still dreamed about that day. Not the fighting, he had made peace with the fighting a long time ago, but the weight of those children in his arms, the way they grabbed onto his armor with small, desperate hands, the sound of their breathing against his neck. That was what he carried. And now he was standing in a market on a station that smelled like burned sugar and death, and a broker with gold bands on his arms was trying to sell him a child to eat. "I asked for food," Elias said, and his voice was quiet and level, and anyone who knew him would have recognized that tone as the most dangerous sound he could make. Not a child. Zilkar's mandibles clicked in that rhythm, the translator called laughter. "But she is food," the Vreth said with what seemed like genuine confusion. "Under Dominion law, all conquered peoples may be classified as consumable resources. This is the natural order. Human. The strong consume the weak and grow stronger. Surely your species understands this." "We understand it," Elias said. "We just decided a long time ago that it was wrong." "Wrong," Zilkar repeated the word as if tasting something unfamiliar. What a strange concept to apply to nature. The Vreth broker leaned closer, and his compound eyes filled Elias' vision. Thousands of tiny lenses, reflecting his own face back at him in fractured pieces. "Let me make this simple for you, human. The child is the cheapest protein available on this station. Your fuel rods would buy you 3 of them. And I am told that Solani flesh is quite compatible with human digestion. So truly this is the most practical solution to your problem." He pushed the cage closer with one of his lower arms, and the metal scraped across the floor again, and the child inside flinched at the sound, but did not look away from Elias. Those golden eyes locked on his face with an intensity that made something twist inside his chest. "Juno," Elias said through the subdermal comms implant behind his ear, speaking so quietly that no translator could catch it. "I'm here, Captain," Juno replied inside his head. "Run a full structural analysis of this station, load-bearing points, environmental system nodes, power distribution, gravity generators, everything." There was a pause that lasted exactly 1.2 seconds, which was a very long time for an AI. "Captain," Juno said, "I recognize this tone. This is the tone you used on Kesari Prime before you walked into a fortified position with nothing but a sidearm and a cutting torch." "Juno." "Running analysis, now, Captain. I want it noted in the log that I advised against whatever you are about to do." "Noted." Elias stepped forward and the 2 Vreth guards behind the cage shifted their weight and tightened their grips on their shock lances, but Elias was not looking at them. He was looking at the child. He knelt down in front of the cage until his face was level with hers, and he could see her clearly through the energy barrier. The fine golden scales that covered her skin, the thin ridges above her eyes that might have been the equivalent of eyebrows, the way her small hands gripped the bars of the cage so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. "Hey," he said softly in English, not caring whether the translator caught it. "I know you are scared. I know this has probably happened before, and every time the person on the other side of these bars has walked away or done something terrible. But I need you to listen to me right now." The child's eyes widened slightly, and her grip on the bars tightened, and she leaned forward just a fraction. "I am going to get you out of here," Elias said, "and I need you to not be afraid when things start happening. Can you do that for me?" She did not understand his words. He knew that, but something in his voice or his face, or maybe just the simple fact that he had knelt down to her level instead of looking down at her, seemed to reach her because she gave a tiny nod, just the smallest dip of her chin. Elias stood up. He turned to face Zilkar and the trading floor and every alien in the vast space who was watching, and he drew a breath, and when he spoke his voice was not quiet anymore. It carried across the market like a blade. "I will take the child." A murmur rippled through the crowd, clicking and hissing and buzzing in a dozen languages, and Zilkar's mandibles spread wide in what the translator called satisfaction. "An excellent choice, human. I will have her prepared and—" "Not as food," Elias said, and his voice cut through Zilkar's words like a door slamming shut. "As my crew, she is coming with me alive and whole, and anyone on this station who tries to stop me is going to learn something about my species that they will not enjoy." The silence that followed was absolute. It lasted 3 full seconds, which does not sound like a long time, but when you are standing alone and unarmed in the middle of a hostile alien trading station, surrounded by guards with weapons and a broker who stands 2 feet taller than you, 3 seconds feels like an eternity. Then Zilkar laughed. It was not the polite clicking of before. This was a full-body sound that made his segmented torso vibrate, and his gold bands rattle and his compound eyes squeeze shut, and it spread to the guards, and then to the other Vreth in the market, until the whole trading floor was filled with the buzzing, clicking roar of insectoid laughter. One human, Zilkar said when he could speak again, unarmed and starving and alone on a station with 3,000 Vreth soldiers, threatening us. He leaned down until his face was close to Elia's, and his mandibles were close enough that Elias could smell the sharp chemical scent of his breath. "What exactly do you think you can do?" Elias smiled. It was the kind of smile that did not touch his eyes, the kind of smile that anyone who had served with him in the war would have recognized as the last thing you saw before everything went sideways. "Juno," he said, "how is that analysis coming?" "Complete, Captain. I have identified 19 critical structural failure points, 6 environmental control nodes, 4 gravity generator access panels, and the main power coupling for this entire station level. Additionally, I have gained access to the station's communication array, an internal sensor network through what I can only describe as embarrassingly poor encryption." "Outstanding. I also want it noted that we are about to do something monumentally inadvisable." "Noted," Elias said, and he looked up at Zilkar with that terrible smile still on his face. "You asked me what I think I can do." He held up one hand and spread his fingers. "Let me show you." And the lights went out. When the lights died, the screaming started immediately. The Vreth were not afraid of the dark. Their compound eyes could see in low light better than most species, but they relied heavily on vibration sense to navigate and communicate and track threats in close quarters. And the first thing Juno did after killing the lights was flood the entire market level with acoustic chaff. It was a simple trick. She overloaded the station's internal speaker system and pushed white noise through every channel at a frequency specifically calibrated to scramble insectoid vibration receptors, and the effect was instantaneous. 3,000 Vreth soldiers went from confident and laughing to blind and deaf in the space of 2 heartbeats. Elias was already moving. He had memorized the layout of the trading floor in the 9 seconds between kneeling in front of the cage and standing back up. It was a habit from the war, a thing his body did automatically in any new space, mapping exits and cover positions and lines of movement the way other people noticed the color of the walls. He reached the cage in 4 strides, and his hands found the energy barrier controls in the dark, and he had disabled enough alien security systems during the war to know that most of them followed the same basic logic: find the power feed and cut it. The barrier dropped, and the child inside made a small sharp sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a word. "It is okay," Elias said, and he reached into the cage and felt small hands grab onto his arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone so small. "I have got you. Hold on to me, and do not let go." She climbed onto him like a creature built for clinging, her arms around his neck and her legs locked around his torso, and her face pressed into his shoulder, and she weighed almost nothing, which told him she had not eaten properly in a very long time. "Juno, give me a path to the docking ring. Corridor 7 to your left. Then down 2 levels via maintenance shaft 12. I am keeping the lights off and the acoustic chaff running on every level between here and the ship, but I should warn you that the Vreth military command on the upper levels will restore local systems within approximately 8 minutes. Then we move fast. He moved into the corridor at a run, and the darkness did not slow him down because Juno was feeding navigation data directly to his comms implant. A soft pulse on the left side of his jaw meant turn left, a pulse on the right meant turn right, and a rapid double pulse meant stop. The first guard found him 40 seconds in. The Vreth soldier came around a corner with a shock lance raised and swinging blindly, and Elias heard him before he saw him. The clicking of chitin on metal floor, the whine of the lance powering up, and he stepped sideways and let the weapon pass through the space where his head had been. And then he took the lance out of the guard's hands with a twist that used the Vreth's own momentum against him, and he put the guard on the floor with a strike to the joint where the upper and lower thorax connected. The guard went down hard and did not get up, but he was breathing, and Elias used the guard's own restraint cuffs to secure him to a corridor support beam. He did not kill him. This was important, and it was deliberate. Elias was not here to start a war. He was here to take a child out of a cage and leave, and every guard he left alive was a witness who would remember that the human had shown mercy even when mercy was not required. But mercy did not mean gentleness. The second group of guards, 4 of them moving in formation despite the noise and the dark, met him at the junction of corridors 7 and 9, and Elias used the shock lance he had taken from the first guard, and he used the walls and the low ceiling, and the fact that the Vreth could not coordinate in the acoustic chaff, and he put all 4 of them down in 11 seconds. He restrained them and kept moving. The child on his back had not made a sound since grabbing onto him, and her grip had not loosened, and he could feel her heartbeat against his spine, fast and light like a small drum. "You are doing great," he told her as he ran almost there. Captain Juno said the station commander has restored environmental controls on levels 3 and 4 and is deploying a full security detail to the docking ring, 20 soldiers with heavy weapons. They will reach the ship before we do. Can you slow them down? I can adjust the gravity generators on level 4 to 0.3 standard for approximately 90 seconds before they override. Do it. Somewhere above them, the gravity shifted, and Elias heard the distant sounds of heavy bodies suddenly finding themselves unable to walk properly. Vreth soldiers stumbling and floating and crashing into walls in a corridor where down had suddenly become a suggestion rather than a rule. He reached the maintenance shaft and climbed down 2 levels with one hand, while the child clung to his back and his shoulders burned, and his empty stomach cramped, and he ignored all of it, because pain was just information and information could be filed away for later. The docking ring corridor was ahead, and Juno had the lights on here, a narrow amber-lit tunnel that led straight to the Gentle Mercy's airlock, and it was almost clear. Almost. Zilkar was waiting. The Vreth broker stood in the middle of the corridor between Elias and his ship, and he was not laughing anymore. Green fluid leaked from a wound on his upper thorax, where he had apparently fought through the chaos to get here, and his compound eyes burned with a fury that needed no translator. "You cannot do this," Zilkar said, and his voice was raw and sharp. "She is property. She is legally classified consumable stock under Dominion law. You are stealing from the Vreth Dominion, and the penalty is death." Elias stopped 10 meters from the broker, and he stood there in the amber light with a child on his back and a stolen shock lance in his hand, and blood on his knuckles from where he had scraped them on a corridor wall, and he was breathing hard, and his body was shaking with hunger and adrenaline. "Step aside," he said. "You are one human," Zilkar snarled, "one starving, pathetic, soft-bodied human on a station with 3,000 soldiers. Elias finished for him. Yes, you mentioned that. And yet here I am at my ship and your soldiers are on the floor behind me. So maybe the number is not the important part." Zilkar's mandibles spread wide and he took a step forward, and Elias raised the shock lance, and the broker stopped. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Elias said something that he knew Juno would record, and that he knew would be transmitted along with everything else. I walked onto this station and asked for food, and you showed me children in cages. You showed me people being sold by the pound. You showed me what your empire really is beneath all the gold and the trade routes and the power. He took a step forward. I am taking this child and I am leaving, and you can either step aside or I can go through you. But either way, I want you to know something. Another step. My ship's AI has been recording and broadcasting everything since I walked through your airlock. Every cage, every price tag, every word you said about selling children as a delicacy. And right now that broadcast is going out on every open frequency in this sector. Zilkar's compound eyes flickered, a reaction that the translator tagged as sudden fear. You wanted to show me how powerful you are, Elia said. Instead you showed the galaxy what you really are, and my species has a saying, Zilkar. He was close now, close enough to see his own face, reflected 1,000 times in those compound eyes. We do not forget. He walked past the broker, and Zilkar did not move to stop him, and Elias reached the airlock and stepped through, and sealed it behind him, and the child on his back finally let out a sound, a long, shuddering breath that might have been a sob or might have been relief. Juno, get us out of here. With pleasure, Captain, detaching docking clamps now. The gentle Mercy pulled away from Station Golhari, and the stars opened up ahead of them, and behind them, Zilkar's voice crackled over the comms channel. You are one human, we are an empire, you will die for this. Elias settled into the pilot's seat with the child still clinging to his back, and he reached up and opened the comms channel, and he said one thing before Juno punched them into FTL. Maybe, but you just made an enemy of my entire species, and trust me when I tell you that is a mistake you will not get to make twice. The stars stretched into lines and the gentle Mercy vanished into faster-than-light travel, and behind them the broadcast kept spreading, jumping from relay to relay, station to station, ship to ship. A recording of cages and children, and a broker laughing about selling a little girl as food. Within 6 hours, it reached the first human outpost. Within 12 hours, it reached Earth. And Earth was not laughing. The broadcast hit the Galactic Concord like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread in every direction at once. Within 24 hours, every major species in the known galaxy had seen the footage, the cages on Station Golhari, the rows of living beings sorted by weight and price, the Vreth broker Zilkar casually explaining that a Solani child was a delicacy while compound eyes glittered with amusement. And then the human. The tired, hungry human with blood on his knuckles saying words that translators carried into 1,000 languages. I asked for food, not a child. The reaction was not uniform. Some species had known about the Vreth consumption hierarchy for centuries, and had looked away because the Vreth were too powerful and too deeply embedded in galactic trade routes to challenge. They controlled the flow of rare minerals and biological compounds that half the galaxy depended on, and picking a fight with them meant economic ruin. Other species were genuinely shocked. They had heard rumors, but rumors were easy to ignore, and footage was not. And then there were the humans. Admiral Rena Osai was 57 years old, and she had commanded the Terran Deep Space Fleet for 9 years, and in all that time, she had never addressed the Galactic Concord directly, because humanity was considered a minor species. 3 centuries of spaceflight against empires that had been sailing the stars for millennia, and minor species were expected to sit in the back and keep their voices down. She did not sit in the back. She walked to the central podium of the Concord chamber on the station, orbiting the neutral world of Peleus, where representatives of 42 species sat in tiered rows that rose toward a ceiling painted with star maps, and she stood there in her black uniform with the silver eagle of the Terran Confederacy on her collar, and she waited until every eye and lens and sensory organ in the room was focused on her. Then she spoke, and her voice was calm and clear and carried no anger, which somehow made it worse. 3 days ago, Captain Elias Varn of the Terran freight vessel Gentle Mercy docked at Vreth Station Golhari requesting food. He was offered a living child as a meal. He refused, and he removed the child from the station, and his ship AI broadcast the evidence of what we have all just seen. She paused and looked around the chamber at 42 species, who had known or suspected or deliberately ignored what the Vreth had been doing. This morning, the Vreth Dominion issued a formal demand. They want the child returned as stolen property, and they want Captain Varn surrendered for execution. Another pause, longer this time. The Terran Confederacy's response is as follows. The child is under our protection and she will not be returned. Captain Varn will not be surrendered. The Solani child is not property. She is a person, and we do not hand people over to be eaten. The chamber was silent. If the Vreth Dominion wishes to dispute this, Admiral Osai said, and she looked directly at the Vreth delegation, 3 massive insectoid figures who sat motionless in their section. They know where to find us. She turned and walked out of the chamber, and she did not look back. The galaxy had not seen anything like it in living memory. A minor species openly defying one of the great powers over a single child of a conquered people that most species could not even find on a star chart. The Vreth response was immediate and furious, not because of the child specifically, but because of the insult. A soft species, a young species, barely 300 years out of their own atmosphere, had publicly humiliated the Dominion in front of the entire conquered. The Vreth War Council authorized a full military mobilization within 48 hours. 200 capital ships and their support fleets began moving toward the contested border between Vreth space and the neutral zone. The message was clear: hand over the human and the child or face annihilation. Meanwhile, Elias Varn sat in the medical bay of the Terran battleship Resolute and watched a doctor scan the child he had carried out of Station Golhari. Her name was Kale. He had learned this not because she told him. She had not spoken a single word since he took her from the cage, but because Juno had accessed the Vreth Station records during the escape and found her registration file, a document that listed her name and age and weight and nutritional value with the same flat bureaucratic language that humans used for livestock inventories. She was 5 years old in Solani terms, and she had been in Vreth custody for 2 of those years, captured during a raid on a Solani refugee convoy, and she had been sold 3 times before Elias found her. The doctor, a young woman named Chen who had kind eyes and gentle hands, finished her scan and stepped out of the room and told Elias what he already knew. She is malnourished, significant muscle wasting, vitamin deficiencies across the board, early signs of bone density loss. Physically, she will recover with proper nutrition and care, but Captain, the psychological profile is. She stopped and pressed her lips together. She has the stress markers of a combat veteran, Chen said quietly. She is 5 years old and her brain chemistry looks like a soldier who has been in a war zone for years. Elias nodded and he went back into the room and sat down in the chair next to Kale's bed, and she was awake, and those golden eyes followed him the way they had followed him since the first moment in the cage, watching, measuring, waiting for something. He did not try to touch her or speak to her or make her feel better with words she could not understand. He just sat there, present and still and close enough that she could see him and know he was not leaving. After an hour she moved. It was small, just her hand sliding across the bed toward his chair, and her fingers found his sleeve and gripped it, and she did not let go. Elias sat very still and felt the weight of her small hand on his arm, and the cold thing in his chest that had been burning, since the trading floor finally settled into something warm and steady. "I am not going anywhere," he said. She did not understand the words, but she understood something because her grip tightened and her golden eyes closed, and for the first time in what he suspected was a very long time she slept. Over the next several days things happened fast. The broadcast had done more than embarrass the Vreth. It had broken something open in the galaxy, a dam that had been holding back decades of fear and silence and complicity. The Solani remnant, scattered refugee groups hiding in the margins of neutral space, sent encoded messages to Terran military channels offering intelligence about Vreth slaving operations, locations of holding facilities, transport routes, numbers. The Dehale Collective, a species that had lost 3 colony worlds to Vreth expansion, offered fuel and supply line access through their territory. The Quiet Ones, a reclusive species that had not spoken in the Conquered in over a century, broke their silence with a single transmission directed at Terran command that contained detailed technical readouts of Vreth ship vulnerabilities. And others came forward, species that had been too small or too afraid or too politically entangled to act alone, reaching out through back channels and encrypted frequencies to say the same thing in a dozen different languages. "We are with you." Elias did not know about most of this. He was focused on the child who slept outside his quarters and ate only when he ate and flinched at loud sounds, and had begun to say one word in broken English that she had picked up from listening to him talk to Juno. Elia. It was close enough. But the galaxy was moving around him whether he knew it or not, and the Vreth war fleet was crossing into contested space. 200 capital ships in attack formation, bristling with weapons, carrying enough firepower to glass a planet, and they expected to find a minor species ready to negotiate or surrender. What they found instead when they dropped out of FTL at the edge of the neutral zone was the Terran Third Fleet in full battle formation, 60 ships, smaller and fewer than the Vreth force, but arranged not in a defensive posture, but in an attack spread, weapons hot, shields up, pointed directly at the Vreth line like a fist. And behind the human ships, arriving through FTL flashes one by one like stars being born, were more ships, Dehale cruisers and Solani scout vessels, and ships from species that had no formal military but had armed their trade ships and come anyway. 11 species. 11 species that had watched the broadcast and heard the human admiral say, "They know where to find us," and had decided independently and without coordination that they were done being afraid. The Vreth fleet commander stared at his tactical display, and for the first time in his career, he saw something that the Vreth Dominion had never faced before. A coalition. Not an alliance built on treaties and trade. Those were fragile things that the Vreth knew how to break, but something rower and more dangerous. A gathering of species united by a single image that none of them could get out of their heads. A human kneeling in front of a cage and saying to a child he had never met, "I am going to get you out of here." The fleet commander opened a channel to the Vreth homeworld and said 4 words that had never been spoken in the history of the Dominion. "They are not retreating." The battle of the neutral line lasted 6 hours and 12 minutes, and it changed the shape of the galaxy forever. The Vreth fleet outnumbered the coalition nearly 2 to 1, and their ships were heavier and more heavily armed, and by every calculation their tactical computers could produce they should have won. They did not win. The problem was not firepower or numbers. The problem was that the Vreth had spent 10,000 years fighting species that were afraid of them, and they had built their entire military doctrine around that fear. Massive, overwhelming force designed to make enemies surrender before the first shot was fired. Humans did not fight that way. Human tactical doctrine had been forged over millennia of fighting the most dangerous enemy they had ever encountered, each other. And it was built on a single principle that the Vreth had never faced and did not understand: adaptability. The Terran Third Fleet did not hold formation and trade volleys the way every other species fought. They broke into small, fast groups that moved independently, communicated constantly, adapted to changing conditions in real time, exploited every gap and weakness and hesitation with a speed that the Vreth command structure could not match. The Vreth gave orders from the top down. The fleet commander told the captains what to do, and the captains told their crews, and every decision passed through the chain of command like water through a pipe. The humans gave their captains a goal and let them figure out how to achieve it, and every ship in the fleet was making its own decisions within a shared framework. And the result was not a single strategy, but 60 strategies operating simultaneously and shifting by the minute. The Vreth had never seen anything like it. And then the coalition ships joined the fight. D-Hail cruisers hitting the Vreth flanks with torpedo runs, while Solani scout ships jammed communications, and the armed trade vessels of 6 other species created chaos in the rear lines. And the Vreth fleet, which had been built to crush a single enemy, found itself fighting a dozen enemies, who were all doing different things at the same time. The Vreth line broke 4 hours in. It did not shatter all at once. It crumbled, ship by ship, section by section, as captains who had never lost a battle found themselves outmaneuvered by opponents who were smaller and weaker, but endlessly creative in the ways they found to fight. By the 6-hour mark, the Vreth fleet commander ordered a full retreat, and the 200 capital ships that had crossed into contested space, expecting a quick victory, limped back toward Vreth territory with 1/3 of their number disabled or destroyed. The coalition lost ships too, 23 vessels from 7 species, over 4,000 lives, and Elias Varn, who watched the battle unfold on a screen aboard the Resolute with a small Solani girl sitting next to him, felt each loss like a stone dropping into water. He had not asked for this. He had asked for food. But wars do not care what you asked for, they care about what you did, and what he did was refuse to let a child be eaten, and that single act of refusal had cracked something open in the galaxy that could not be closed again. The war that followed was not long. The Vreth Dominion had ruled through fear for 10,000 years, and fear is the most brittle material in the universe. It holds everything together until the moment it breaks, and then it breaks all at once. System by system, the Dominion came apart. Conquered species who had been silent for centuries rose up, not with great fleets or armies, but with small stubborn acts of defiance that multiplied and spread. Workers who refused to process shipments, administrators who lost paperwork, engineers who found that critical systems needed maintenance at inconvenient times. The Vreth could not fight an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere, and the harder they cracked down, the more resistance they created. Within 4 months, the outer territories had declared independence, and within 6 months, the Vreth homeworld was blockaded by a coalition fleet, and the Dominion Council, facing economic collapse, military defeat, and the rebellion of every species they had ever conquered, agreed to negotiate. The Treaty of Goldie was signed on a neutral station, orbiting a blue dwarf star that nobody had ever heard of before, and would never forget after. It was the first universal ban on sentient trafficking in galactic history. Humanity wrote the first draft, a document that was blunt and simple and left no room for interpretation, and 11 species co-signed, and the Vreth were given a choice: comply or face permanent blockade of every trade route their economy depended on. They complied. The treaty also established the Conquered Enforcement Authority, a joint military and humanitarian force tasked with locating and liberating trafficking victims across former Vreth territory. And in the first year of its operation, the authority freed over 2 million beings from holding facilities and processing centers scattered across 47 star systems. 2 million. That was the number that broke people, not the battle statistics or the diplomatic victories, but the sheer scale of suffering that had been happening in plain sight, while the galaxy looked away. Elias Varn did not attend the treaty signing. He was asked. Admiral Osai personally invited him, and the Solani government wanted to honor him, and 3 different species offered to name warships after him. But he said no to all of it, and everyone who knew him understood why. He was not a symbol, and he was not a hero, and he was not interested in standing on stages while people applauded. He was a freight hauler with a bad ship, and a good AI, and a child who needed him more than the galaxy needed another monument. The Gentle Mercy had been repaired and restocked by the Terran Navy, whether Elias wanted it or not. They had replaced the food synthesizer and upgraded the medical bay, and patched the hull, and Juno had received a processing upgrade that she described as pleasant but unnecessary, as I was already quite capable. And Kale was with him. She was always with him now. She had claimed the co-pilot's seat on the first day aboard the repaired ship, and she sat there with her golden legs pulled up beneath her, and her golden eyes watching the stars through the cockpit window, with an expression that Elias had learned to read as wonder. She was speaking more. Her Solani was coming back in fragments and pieces as she reconnected with the language she had been raised in, and alongside it, she was building a small but growing vocabulary of human English that she used with fierce determination and occasional creative grammar. She called him Elia because she could not quite manage the S sound at the end, and he had stopped correcting her because he liked the way it sounded, like a name that belonged to someone kinder and softer than the man he thought he was. She called Juno Ju, and she talked to the AI constantly, asking questions in her mixed language that Juno answered with infinite patience, and a warmth that Elias had never heard in the AI's voice before. She called the Gentle Mercy home, and that was the word that broke him. Not during the battle, not during the treaty, not during any of the enormous galaxy-shaking events that had followed his walk through Station Golhari. It was a 5-year-old girl sitting in a co-pilot seat that was too big for her, pointing at his ship and saying, "Home," in a small clear voice that cracked something open in his chest that he had kept sealed since the war. He had been alone for a long time. He was not alone anymore. In the weeks and months that followed, historians and diplomats and scholars from dozens of species tried to understand what had happened, how a single human on a cargo ship had triggered the collapse of one of the oldest empires in the galaxy. A galactic conquered historian traveled to the Vreth homeworld to interview a senior diplomat, one of the same officials who had sat in the conquered chamber when Admiral Os delivered her response, and she asked him a simple question. How did this happen? How did one human on a broken ship bring down the Dominion? The Vreth diplomat sat in silence for a long time, and when he spoke his mandibles moved slowly, and the translator rendered his words in a voice that carried something even the machine recognized as exhaustion. We made the mistake that every species makes with humans. We assumed that because they are soft they are weak. We showed them cruelty and expected submission. We showed them a child in a cage and expected them to look away the way every other species does, because that is rational, that is logical, that is what the mathematics of power demands. He paused. Instead, that one man looked at a child he had never met, a child of a species he had no connection to, a child who was not his responsibility in any way, and he decided that our entire empire needed to end. And then he went home, and his species agreed with him. The diplomat's compound eyes dimmed. We did not understand, we still do not fully understand, what drives them to do this. It is not strategy, it is not politics, it is not rational self-interest. It is something in their biology, something in the architecture of their minds that will not allow them to see a child suffer and do nothing. He looked at the historian. That is why they terrify me, not their weapons, not their ships, not their soldiers, but the fact that they will burn the galaxy down for a single child, and they will not even hesitate. Far away, in a quiet corner of the galaxy where the stars were thick and bright, the Gentle Mercy drifted through open space with nowhere in particular to go and no schedule to keep. In the cockpit, Elias sat in the pilot's seat with a bowl of hot soup in his hands, real soup, made from real ingredients by a synthesizer that actually worked. And he ate slowly and carefully, and savored every bite because he remembered what it felt like to be hungry. Next to him, in the co-pilot's seat, Kale sat with her own bowl, smaller, filled with a Solani broth that Juno had learned to make from a recipe database provided by the Solani Refugee Council. And she ate with the same slow, careful attention as Elias, because she remembered too. Through the speakers, Juno hummed a melody, an old Earth lullaby that she had found in her cultural archives, something gentle and warm that filled the cockpit like sunlight. Kale looked up from her bowl and her golden eyes caught the light of a passing star, and she looked at Elias and she smiled. Not a big smile, not a dramatic smile, but a real one, the kind of smile that meant safety and warmth and the absence of fear. "Elia," she said. "Yeah, kid." "Home." He looked at her and he looked at the stars, and he felt the warmth of the soup in his hands and the hum of the ship around him, and the presence of a small, brave girl who had survived things that no child should ever have to survive. "Yeah," he said, "home." And the gentle Mercy sailed on into the stars, carrying a man who had asked for nothing but food and a child who had been offered as a meal and an AI who hummed lullabies in the dark. Three souls bound together by a moment of simple, stubborn decency that had shaken the foundations of an empire and taught the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. Humans do not tolerate the suffering of children. This is not a policy. It is not a strategy. It is something far more dangerous. It is instinct.